Ansikakyao, Tawal, thank you everybody for joining us today. I am certain that we will still have people joining us. I know it's become sort of a culture using Zoom now that we have to wait 2 minutes past. Eventually it's going to be 5-10 minutes past. Maybe it signals a slowing down, but I doubt it. So we have a great event. This is sort of the third culminating event in a number of events that we've had so far, thinking about Indigenous peoples and Ukrainian settlers specifically, and some of the relationships to land before meeting one another, some of the relationships to the land that we've had since coming together, and now thinking into the future. So we have some fantastic people speaking today, but we're also very, very happy to have Elder Francis Boychak joining us here to open for us in a good way. And once Elder Francis has a chance to speak to us all, if you've seen me moderate before, I don't like reading out lots of bios and introducing everybody while we all fidget. I really like it to be more dynamic, and I'm going to invite the panelists each to tell you something about themselves, locate themselves a little bit for us all. So Elder Francis Boychak, please, if you will, go ahead and open things up for us. Hi.
Hi, Chelsea. Ahano ako makanak. Kawiatiko kisi ko nitsika son. Nehio ni nitskopo nehuche. So my ceremonial name is Fine Day, although I'm known as Elder and Dr. Francis Boychak. I'm Cree from Saddle Lake. I'm a residential school survivor. And I'm very honored to be with you here today. And I want to thank Larissa for visiting my office today, making a special trip to give me the tobacco protocol as well as a ceremonial cloth. And this tobacco is significant as the first medicine that we signed treaties with in the sacred pipe. And so we carry that fire within our ceremonies, and that's very significant, especially with the fire teachings that we had outside MacEwan today. So I want to thank everyone and wish everyone a good evening. And today I have, I'm not going to do the smudge because I've been smudging all day, so I should be smudged enough, but I wanted to do an opening song with the eagle song. And because the eagle in our culture is known as the messenger to the creator, and we believe that that spirit, that our prayers will go up. And so this song basically says, from the eagle, I am the king of the skies, my children, my grandchildren. I am the king of the skies. Life is, I'm getting a little bit mixed up, but I'm the king of the skies. And whenever you call upon me, my children, I will listen to you. I will hear your cry, and I will come and bring this prayer to the creator. So it kind of goes like this. song basically says when we do our prayers in a time of need and we call upon that spirit to bring our prayer to the Creator, that the Creator will hear us. Chiweo ki sik, it is so quiet up in the skies, in the heavens, the universe, that you can hear the silence. And I have had this experience once in my life when I was sitting atop some hills, and it was so quiet, and all of a sudden you could hear this, and it was such a wonderful experience to have experienced that. So I thought I'd share that song with you, and bear with me. Since Cree is my first language, Mamo Tawimao, Great Spirit, I give you thanks for this life that you give us every day, always first and foremost. It is indeed a precious gift, especially in this time of COVID. But us here that are still alive, as we've just finished Remembrance Day and thought of those souls that gave up their lives so we could be free, both Indigenous and all Canadians, all cultures, they were known as brothers. They knew no discrimination, but got along in sacred connectiveness and relationship. And this is how we should be as humans here today when we live in this world of turmoil. But to practice what we learn from the sweet grass in the way of kindness, in the way of forgiveness, and our humanity and compassion to one another. In recent texts today, I have heard the lives of one 91-year-old friend that I knew that has gone to the spirit world as early as yesterday. I also have heard the death of one of my granddaughters that committed suicide. She was only 19. And so for those spirits, the loss of those spirits, I ask for support and prayers, especially for the grieving families. And so for our own lives here today and what we have to share, let us do it in the spirit of love. I nîkânihk, all my relations.
Mr. Hey, thank you very much for those words. I think it's really important as we start this conversation to think about what the elder just said there is, always remember, I think it's really easy in this sort of new age where we're communicating always online to each other. We sort of forget one another's humanity. It's very easy to treat each other with indifference and even cruelty when you don't have to sit face to face with somebody. And one of the things that I've really been reflecting on over this time, over this pandemic, is how important those personal connections are. And this is in fact why we're meeting today, because we are going to continue to live together on these lands. And we have the option to do that in a good way, in a way that supports one another and ensures that we all have the necessities of life, and that we treat one another with compassion, knowing that each one of us at some point in our lives is going to need compassion. Or we can fight, we can be argumentative, we could be in an adversarial role towards one another and towards our environment. And we've already seen the immense impacts that kind of relationship has had. So this is why we smudge too. It's a good way to open up your mind, open up your thoughts, open up your words and your heart to one another, and center yourselves before a meeting like this. So I thought that song was really good for this. So we're talking today about our futures, okay? And in Cree, you have two ways of saying our. You can say nîkânihk, which is us, not you, or you can say kîanau, which is all of us. So when we're talking about our futures on these lands, we're talking about kîanau, all of us. And this follows sort of an exploration of land-based practices in Ukraine and here before settlement. And then we did another panel where we talked about some of the legislative and social and policy choices in Canada that impacted Indigenous peoples differently than settlers, including Ukrainians. And now we're here to think sort of more into the future. Where can we be going? What kinds of things can we take from our pasts, our shared pasts, our different pasts, bringing into the future in a good way? What things can we leave behind? What things don't we need? So as I mentioned, I'm going to get the panelists to introduce themselves, but I just want to let you know as well that we are going to have time at the end about 20 to 30 minutes to answer questions. So until then, if you want to throw your questions into the Q&A section rather than the chat, at the end, I'll go through and we'll get to those, as many of those questions as possible. All right, so I'm going to just start with who I happen to see on the top of my screen, Leah, fellow Faculty of Native Studies student and great person. So Leah, if you would please start us off with an auto introduction.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chelsea. As Chelsea said, my name is Leah Hertzun, and I am a second-year PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies. As Chelsea may have alluded to, I have been around the Faculty of Native Studies for quite some time. I'm currently working on my third degree in the faculty, so I have been around for a little while, having the pleasure of working with wonderful folks like Chelsea. I am a settler who grew up in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, so that is what is also known as Edmonton. As of 5 weeks ago, I am also now a visitor to Toronto, and so I am learning about what it means to now be living in a new space, in a new place, in a new territory that I don't know a lot about. And so this is one of the things that is actually, for me, really exciting. I'm really excited to learn about this new place that I get to share and call home, and what that means for me as a settler now living in a different area. It also means that I have to negotiate relationships with my family members that I've left behind, and how I negotiate being part of things back in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, while at the same time creating new spaces for myself here in Toronto. So that is me in a little nutshell. My research focuses specifically on Indigenous and Ukrainian relations in East Central Alberta. I'll get to talk about that a little bit more as we talk about some of the things from our past that I think can help us in the future. And so for now, I will turn the mic back to Chelsea, and as we introduce the next panelist.
Thank you very much. Barry, you're next up on my chopping block.
Right on. Tanse Berblinski and Tsiga Sun. My name is Barry. I am from Amiskwaciwâskahikan, but I'm currently in Calgary. I just got here like 5 seconds ago. So yeah, Mohkinstis, Blackfoot territory, Tsuut'ina, Nakota territory. But I'm Métis Cree on my mother's side and Ukrainian on my father's side, from Edmonton. I'm a theater and film artist primarily. I've come into this conversation a lot due to my directing and creation of the Ancestors and Elders production put on with Shumka Ukrainian dancers in Edmonton a few years ago. My Ukrainian heritage hasn't been hugely part of my life, but it has become part of what I talk about now. So that's pretty much where I'm at right now for the conversation.
Awesome. Hi. Tara.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tara Nîkânihk, and I am a third-generation Ukrainian Canadian on my paternal side. I grew up in Treaty 6 territory in Fort Saskatchewan, and I completed my Master of Arts degree in 2019 through the Faculty of Gender and Social Justice through the Faculty of Women and Gender Studies. And it was both my work in First Nation, Métis, and Inuit educational policy, and thinking about myself and my identity and where I am in that work, and as well where I was in taking courses through my gender and social justice program, that got me really thinking and coming to a place where I really wanted to think critically about how we can remember differently my relationship as a Ukrainian Canadian settler to Indigenous peoples and our relationship moving forward. And so I am very much so looking forward to this conversation with all the folks today. And I will turn it back to Chelsea.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And Leon, I don't want to, you're certainly not least. It just happened to be the last one on my screen.
Thank you. My name is Leon Boychak Hunter, and I grew up in Amiskwachee, Waskaigan as well, also known as the city of Edmonton, and on river lot number 10 there as well. I currently reside and work at Métis Crossing as the manager here, and I've done so for the past 7 years. And I ended up in this role in university. I studied drama, majoring in drama, and I obtained a Bachelor of Arts from that school. And as I was completing that job, I started working at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village and in a role of cultural interpretation. And that work in cultural interpretation is sort of what led me into my present role here at Métis Crossing. So I've been exploring and working with the Métis Nation of Alberta in sharing land-based learning opportunities with visitors and guests, helping facilitate Indigenous Peoples Day celebrations, all kinds of different events. Just recently, we hosted the Métis Nation of Alberta's annual General Assembly for the second time here at Métis Crossing, the first time inside the new Cultural Gathering Centre. And so it's really been, the last 7.5 years have really been a continual learning experience as we have watched the development of Métis Crossing continue to grow and develop into the dream of the Métis Nation to have a place of cultural sharing has really progressed and developed into this amazing place today, and really looking forward at what the future holds. And so very honored to be talking about this subject between Ukrainian and Indigenous relationships, because it is something that I have been sort of a part of for my entire life, and also my ancestors' lives as well. My grandfather was lived from a place called St. Paul, Alberta, and he had regular relationships with the Indigenous people of Saddle Lake there. So it's very honored to be part of this conversation today.
Hi. All right, so when I had originally met with all of these fine folks, I told them that I was going to be putting them a little bit on the spot, and I was just going to have them do a small thing, which was solve all of our problems. So thinking about land-based practices going into the future, and thinking about like the things that you've learned about, Kayas long ago, thinking about what works now, the sorts of pressures we're under, I was hoping that each one of you could speak from the work that you do about where you would like to see us headed. So what, rather than, I'm not going to get you at this point to give us the 122 step program to utopia, but I do want you to cast your minds there and tell me what it would look like for you. What would an ideal situation of living well on the land together, all of us, look like for you? How would, in however you want to describe that, and just assume that you have all the resources that you could possibly need to get there. You don't have to explain how to get there. It's just, we're there, we're in the future. So let's do some time traveling into the future now. We're in space, time. All right, so I'm gonna go in the same sort of order and just get each one of you to talk a little bit about how you're gonna just solve everyone's problems. I love it. All right, Leah.
Excellent, perfect. Yeah, I'll get right to it. I've been thinking a lot about this and how exactly from my perspective, how to tackle this type of question. What sort of future do I see? Because a lot of my research is a lot more historical. Yeah, it comes into the present, but it really is based a lot more in history. But one of the things I've actually been writing about lately is I'm doing my comprehensive exams in Indigenous studies right now. And so what that means is really trying to think about what Indigenous studies is, what it means. And one of the biggest things that I'm taking away from my readings, from my writings, is the importance of Indigenous futurities. How can we, as scholars, even if we're focusing on history or social issues, how do we see this promoting futures? How do we see a world where Indigenous folks and settlers can live together in a good way? So I've been thinking a lot about this. And so one of the things that I'm finding that my brain keeps coming back to is the questioning that I always get when I talk about my research and when I speak to people about my research it depends on who they are as to what sort of questions I get. So one of the big questions that I get from my Ukrainian Canadian settler relations and relatives is, do you think that there are folks who share Ukrainian and Indigenous ancestry? And this is a question that I never get from those folks who I call friends who are Indigenous, because they know that many of their relations are Ukrainian. And so why I bring this question up is because I wonder how we got to this point. How did we get to the point where our Ukrainian Canadian kin don't know that they share kinship relations with Indigenous people? What happened to break down those relationships that separated families, that separated kin from one another? And so in the future that I see that we don't have to ask those questions anymore, that we know who all of our relations are, that we know who all of our kin is, that regardless of how it happened, and that we need to know how it happened. We need to dissect and understand these things so that they don't happen again in the future, but also in a way that we don't blame our ancestors for what happened. We just work to fix it. We work to regain all of our relations. And so that's the future that I see, is a place and a space where we don't have to ask these questions, where we know our kin, we know our Ukrainian kin, we know Indigenous kin, and we know that folks did build families together. And so reconnecting in those ways. So that's the future that I see and I really want to work toward. So yeah, thanks.
That's awesome. So that really ties into Wakutuin, which is like a Cree Métis principle of expanding kinship. But what I love about this is the concept of knowing who we are in relation to other people. And when you were describing that, how people have that question, but Indigenous peoples don't, is interesting because, you know, Indigenous people often talk about this sort of solitude that we experience, where we go into the cities, we go into non-Indigenous communities, but there's not really much of a flow in the other direction, and people don't know us. And so we literally at this point in time do not know how we are in relationship to one another, and not just like actually being related, but like, how do we relate? And so, I mean, that's why we're having this conversation, but getting there as a goal is absolutely makes sense to me. That's fantastic. Barry, what are your thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Holy, this question. Trying to figure out the right thread to pull. I've got a few different ideas going on right now. Some of the dominant teachings I've been given, just to kind of blanket credit, come from Jerry Saddleback and Darlene Auger, a mixture of those two from a Cree perspective, as well as what I've learned from Dr. Leroy Littlebear, Blackfoot scholar and amazing human being, elder. And so I'm going to try and articulate what I'm thinking here, which is that this idea of Wokotuwin, our connection to one another, our kinship between one another, I think it kind of gets a little bit esoteric when we start talking about it in relationship to the land. What does that actually mean? The way I've been taught, that there's these hierarchies that we were kind of connected to, and our relationship to it is that we're actually quite humble in the face of our plant and animal kin, as well as the kin that we have in the stars and the mountains and the waters and everything. And when we start to realize just how vulnerable we are as human beings, in the face of not having our connections to land, animals, water, etc., it really puts our relationships to one another in perspective. I think about that. Like I said, it's a walk. There's a lot. There's a lot going on. But in order for us to live, harmoniously, to all function together, I think that's a much more massive component. I once asked Dr. Leroy about why is there so much resistance to people just wrapping their heads around Wokotowin, and that the territory has a spirit, and that, you know, the land has, that we are responsible, or that we have a relationship to the land. And his wife Amethyst said, because people are afraid of being responsible. If I'm not just responsible for myself, but I'm responsible for you and your family, and for the water, and for the trees, and for the ecosystem as well, all of a sudden the expectation on me goes a lot higher as to what I have to do. And, you know, as individuals, we get scared of that. And as communities, we get scared of that. Is it the responsibility of the Ukrainian community to execute reconciliation in Canada? Is it their problem? And we started to realize that all these problems are interconnected and a lot more complicated, and that we have to have more complicated conversations in order to figure out how to remedy them. You know, just looking at the watershed issues that are happening in BC right now, as a direct relation to the fires that were happening that destroyed, you know, the ecosystem there, which is directly related to human activity. You know, so you see, like, there's so many ways that every individual activity affects the larger ecosystem, and I think we're kind of getting slammed with it right now. All that to say, I think the intention of the idea of we're all treaty people, to put people in a position where they realize that their actions, their behaviors, and their responsibilities are all connected to this exercise that we have here in Canada, that it's a lot more interconnected. There's a thought in there somewhere. I don't know.
There was a lot in there. I'm really thinking about that concept of people being afraid of responsibility really hit home, because I think what's interesting is if you consider responsibility within a hierarchy, then you have a certain number of people who are responsible and everybody else gets to just, you know, not worry about it. But if you think of responsibility within reciprocity, then not only is it just a burden that you bear, it's that you share the responsibility with others, and the things that you do are reciprocal, whether we're talking about our relationships with other human beings, our non-human kin, plant and animal kin, or to the earth itself. And so that kind of relationship, that non-hierarchical relationship, is not a scary burden we should avoid, but rather a recognition of the ways that we support one another. And I think becoming more aware of that would actually bring down that fear a little bit. I think that, you know, honestly, I say this all the time, but living under capitalism in a settler colonial state is incredibly disempowering on purpose. There are very few people, regardless of your background, whether you're Indigenous or not, who feel empowered in this society, who feel like they can make concrete changes. All of us are just trying to survive and do our thing in our own little spheres. And so we're afraid of expanding those spheres because of what you're talking about, taking on more responsibility. But what if we saw that expansion as a strength, as a way that we survive? And we see it happen all the time. Right now, with everything that's going on in BC, we're seeing a massive mobilization of material help, of people caring about one another. And we see this regardless of the disaster. We're sort of in the mindset that when things are bad, everybody turns against one another. But if you look at how it actually plays out, that's not what human beings do. We tend to reach out. And I think if we spent more time thinking about that instead of being afraid of one another, we would be a lot stronger as people. So yeah, thank you for that. It was awesome. Tara.
Yeah, and I think where my perspective and my line of thinking, I think it it grows from Barry's points that he's just made. My kind of thinking is around remembering differently our stories and retelling our stories differently, and thinking about collective accountability and living with accountability. So as settlers, you know, how rejecting single stories of Ukrainian Canadians that don't talk about whiteness and don't talk about how our story of coming to be in this place is in relation to settler colonialism, and how can we tell these stories in a relational way to and about each other. And so when I think about the future, I think about, you know, planting and watering and tending to our relationships every single time we experience, we encounter, or we story our relationship to each other and to this place. And coming to a new knowing that takes into consideration our accountability to each other and to this place. And I think, Chelsea, you've talked about Barry's point about how that when we take it on as a collective accountability and a collective responsibility, we don't have to, we can confront the feeling that is uncomfortable, and we can confront feelings of being scared or angry of taking on responsibility, because we're shouldering it together. And so I think further from that, and again, this isn't an endpoint, but this is kind of a how we get there type piece in thinking about how can we reject and diverge from colonial goals, particularly as white settlers. So how can we reject the us versus them, and how can we reject individualism in order to support community and supporting land back? And yeah, so I really think about how can we, each and every time we think about who we are and how we've come to this place, how can we think about it in a relational way? And I think that gets us to thinking about how we exist in the future in a better way.
Hi. Yeah, I think what is also becoming extremely apparent to all of us in very real lived terms is how local we all live. You know, it's really easy when we're getting goods sent from literally across the planet, and we're relying on this supply chain, and you know, it's just sort of globalization and but we still just live where we live. And when we're cut off, that's it. That's all we got. We got each other, and we got the resources there. And so, you know, that's the way it's always sort of been. And what are we doing right now to foster our reliance? And it can't just be self-reliance. None of us can exist like that. So how are we fostering our reliance on one another so that, you know, we live locally in a way that is you know, it also takes into account our responsibilities here in Canada to what's going on in other countries, right? Like, even as Indigenous peoples, we can't just sit here and be like, you know, people are being exploited elsewhere, and you know, maybe we're also participating in, you know, capitalism, because we can't just not. You don't just get to turn it off. It's there. We exist within capitalism, within a colonial society. You don't just get to walk away from it. But then what are our collective responsibilities to the collective as a whole, all of humanity, not just even, you know, where we live specifically. So focusing on, yes, those relationships where we live, but also thinking about how the way we live impacts the way people live everywhere, right? So yeah, no big deal, just solving all the problems. So Leon, just tell us your big your big hopes for the future.
Yeah, I think when we think about the future, Indigenous Ukrainian relations, Indigenous and, you know, the rest of the world relations, I think the ideal future is there's less intention behind understanding these different cultures. Like currently, you know, there's very much an intention to go and experience the other culture. But I think the ideal future is that we've all, you know, made those friendships, made those relationships, been part of the cultural experiences of these Indigenous communities, that it's already baked in, it's ingrained in our understanding of the land that we reside on. And, you know, you talked about, Chelsea, in response to Leah's comment, you know, the awareness of entering a different community, where that, you know, I don't want to like lose the specialness of those sensitive communities, but losing the awareness that I'm going into another community and there's this sense of, oh, maybe I'm a foreigner, or maybe I don't have friends there, that disappears, and that we can enter those communities with anticipation that, oh, I'm going to run into my friend there, or I'm going to meet somebody new there, and that's going to be a very, you know, positive relationship. And so that's my that's my and hope for the future, that we are understanding each other's customs, understanding each other's cultures, and really, really feel welcome there. I know when we put on events, we make sure that we always put everyone welcome, so that this thought that, oh, you know, and I get messages all the time from people like, oh, there's this event happening at Buffalo Lake. Can I go as a non-Indigenous person? And you know, and I can't speak necessarily for that community, but I think that the more and more that these relationships develop with the intentionality that we're putting into it right now, the less intentionality we'll have to put into it in the future. And so I think that that's really the place that we want to get to, that these relationships are natural, and they're meaningful, they're positive, and they continue to naturally be symbiotic moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thinking about relationships in that non-extractive way, right? Because the way that, yeah, when we talk about come into community and do this, a lot of times we're sort of suggesting that people just consume culture in particular ways that, you know, so we tend to know under multiculturalism that culture does get consumed. You know, we talk about food. Like when I think about the very little that I know about my own Ukrainian heritage, it's based in food. It's based in, you know, clothing. It's based in those things that you can commodify, but you can't commodify relationships. You can't commodify friendships because they're reciprocal, right? So moving past commodification into those relationships is really good. And there's a question. I said I wasn't going to deal with questions, but I think this really fits in well because it's talking about language. So the role that language has. So thinking about not just Indigenous languages, of which there's over 60 different Indigenous languages in Canada, many dialects, many specific words used in specific communities, but also other languages. And I think about the worldviews that are represented in each one of those languages, and what a loss it is for all of humanity when that worldview is no longer there because the language is gone. So putting this to all of you, I want you to think about sort of, you know, stuff like language, culture, relationships, but also I want to turn to the non-metaphorical concept of land back, because, you know, there was a movement about decolonization. We're going to decolonize all the things. And Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang were like, okay, decolonization is not a metaphor. So then, you know, it's not just everything that you want to do. Let's decolonize, I don't know, bath bombs, right? It's ridiculous. But then we started talking about land back because it should be extremely clear that this is not a metaphor. And Canada has turned around in a very, very short period of time and is starting to use it as a metaphor. So let's not talk about it as something that, you know, that isn't land back. I want to get all of your opinions on what land back is, what you think it is, what it could look like, and what does it mean for this future that we're talking about? Is it just going to create division? Is it possible? What even is it from your perspective? I'm curious, Leah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And thanks for putting me on the spot about that one. This is a question that I actually deal with, I don't know, think about a lot, and think about how I, as a settler, have a very different relationship to land back. I wanted to talk quickly before we talk about land back. I want to talk quickly about language, bringing this back to language. So one of the things about me is that as a third generation Ukrainian Canadian, I actually don't speak a word of English. Or sorry, I don't speak a word of Ukrainian. I'm sorry. I probably don't speak English that well either. But I don't actually speak Ukrainian, other than I knew enough to say to my great Baba or my great grandmother, Shadaita Baba, which is sit down Baba, because then she would come and she would stroke your hand, because she actually did immigrate to Canada until 1927 when she was 24 years old. And so she had the opportunity to live a whole life, really, before she came over. And fortunately for me, she didn't pass until she was 99. And so I was well into my high school years before she passed. But one of the things that I regret now, especially with the recent passing of my Baba, who's so tied to this research, is that I'm really missing that extra generational connection, that inability to actually really connect with my great grandmother, because she only spoke Ukrainian and I only spoke English. And that was something that, you know, the generations had really instilled in us, is that we cannot speak Ukrainian. We need our kids to do well. And so they need to speak English. And so I really sort of reflect on how much I missed from my great-grandmother, her teachings. I know that in the old country, at a certain point in time after the war, they had to share 7 horses between, or sorry, 1 horse between 7 families. And so I would have loved to have learned more about that. I would have loved to have learned more about the role and the relationship that she had with land specifically. I would have loved to learn why specifically she had to plant the peas on crosses, because that's what the land demanded. Like, so there's all of these different relationships to land that she had that we as non-Ukrainian speakers really missed out on. And so that's one of the things. So sort of thinking about land back and about how the relationship, even my ancestors' relationship to land was interrupted when they came here because everything was different. Everything was so different. And while they tried to bring in their new relationships to land, oftentimes with the further generations, it really, that relationship was lost. And so when I think about land back in the current context, when we think about land back is not a metaphor, picking up from Tuck and Yang's decolonization is not a metaphor. I personally, I am scared. And I have to admit that, because I think, as Barry and Tara were talking about, I feel like it puts so much responsibility on my shoulders. And I feel like when I talk to people about land back, or just say land back to many of my kin who are farmers, who continue to be farmers, who live in rural communities, and they hear land back, they immediately think that it's going to be this really extractive process, that they're going to have to go back to where they came from, to a land that they don't know, to be totally uprooted. It's like they think that the same forces that dispossessed Indigenous people from the lands they now occupy are going to come in and now dispossess them, sort of like a tit for tat kind of thing. And so I often don't know, and I think it's because I don't know enough about the intentions of the land back. And I know what the intention of the land back movement is, but I don't know enough of it in practical terms to be able to then say to my kin who are still living on land and who think that it is theirs, how they can change their relationship with land, how they don't have to shoulder all of the responsibility of the land back movement in an individual way. And also that even though we are scared, that we don't have to be scared, that being scared of the uncertain is a natural feeling. And there's also, when I think about land back, there's also this idea that comes to mind about how in the society that we live in, we are so scared to be told we're wrong. There's this perception that we have to be right. And if somebody comes in and questions us or asks us something, that we can't admit that we were wrong, we have to hold on to those beliefs. And so one of the things about the land back movement is that I'm excited about responsibility. I'm excited about group responsibility, about community responsibility, about the ways in which we can show our kin who do currently live on land that it's okay to be scared, it's okay to not know, but that we need to work through these things together. We need to think through relationality. We need to be better relations, and then the land back is going to come. That's my thought about that. So thanks.
No, I love that. And I think it's good that you brought up some of the fears that people have about this, especially because, for people who've been talking about it for a while, it's not a new concept. But if you're encountering it for the first time, yes, I call it settler colonial anxiety. The idea that if Indigenous peoples get land back or sovereignty or anything like that, that we're going to do unto people as has been done to us. But there's absolutely no desire. Nobody wants to continue oppression, like that's not at all the goal. And I put into the chat a really great article from Briar Patch magazine about the Treaty Land Sharing Network in Saskatchewan, which is looking into moving into Alberta as well. And so it's very much based on relationships, people living on the land And we, okay, let's be clear too, we all live in the land, even if you're in an urban space, right? It's really important to remember that. So you know, as we talk about this and people share their thoughts, I will put more links in so you can start looking at the way that people are thinking about this. It's not about dispossession. The fact is that, you know, like the every elder that I've ever heard from talks about the great wealth of these lands, the ability of these lands to support us all. And, you know, the very injustice that exists in the fact that anybody could be homeless, that anybody could go hungry, that anybody could be, you know, left alone without kin, without supports on these lands is ridiculous when we think about the wealth that we actually have. So, and I'm not just talking about extraction again, I'm talking about the wealth that we have because of our relationships with the land, with our plant kin, with our animal kin, with our human kin. So to think about it as expansive and rather than something that is going to kick people out, and as sort of climate disasters continue to happen, we also have to consider the massive amount of displacement that is happening globally. What are we going to do? How are we going to organize our communities about taking in people who are displaced? You know, if we organize around thinking that we can all survive, then I think we are going towards a world that's very different than if we think we have to keep people out so that we can have our slice of the pie. So Barry, what are your thoughts on land back?
Oh man, sorry, before that, Elder Francis, did you put your hand up to speak, or?
Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say everybody's comments is very interesting, and a lot of thoughts that we can share there. This land thing is basically what I understand is just the knowledge of recognition of you know, these territorial acknowledgements and how the first people lived here, and it's all about connection to the elements. And certainly Barry made some important comments on what's happening in BC, and you know, the fires that happened really destroyed a lot of the trees. And knowing the history from an Aboriginal perspective, that trees hold water back and they control the Mother Earth, you know, with the roots. So when all that is gone, it's not hard to see the imbalance of the flooding and everything that's going down the hill and destroying. If we don't respect the environment, as much as those elements give life, they can take life and basically, you know, create a lot of chaos. So even like last week, it was so sunny here in Alberta, and all of a sudden, bang, yesterday, it just snowstormed like crazy. And, you know, it caused a lot of chaos. So you think about climate change, it can lead to a lot of topics. But that wasn't really what I was wanted to talk about. When we had, Chelsea mentioned dreams, and I got to think and listen to everybody. Some of it has already happened. When I was working at the Misquachie Academy, some dancers came from the city of Vegreville and performed for our students. So that brought me back to the mind. It has to start with the young people and the performances in the school, establishing those relationships there. And so those young people will support and mingle with one another. That's kind of what's happening in a lot of the schools nowadays to prevent that racism from happening, and young people working together. The other thing is the idea of the Métis Crossing, the Victoria Settlement, all getting together for the future. It kind of reminded me of what we had here in Kiwetstown when we shared a meal, Ukrainians, and we were natives cooking bannock and stuff like that, sharing the food sources, just like Heritage Days, and learning from one another and mingling, which caused that relationship building. And I still look forward to that in the future. And I was thinking, you know, in our powwows, we've had Maoris coming on a special to do performances. We've had Hawaiians coming to do the hula, you know, and stuff like that. And, you know, during the breaks and giving our dancers a rest, why couldn't the Ukrainians come and do that, you know, and build relationships like that? And of course, I would have to go through the powwow committees or the chiefs, but I'm sure there could be communication, relationship building in that way. So I thought I'd mention some of these. And when Barry mentioned his film, I remember watching that beauty of Ukrainians dancing with the cultural dancing. It was so beautiful, you know, and of course there was a whole talk about it. People really love that, and I still think that a lot of the communities would really appreciate that. So inclusiveness, approach to Indigenous communities, there's lots that can be done. And in the last meeting that we had, I certainly love Ukrainian people, because that's where I learned how to drive tractor. That's where I learned how to garden and, you know, how to milk cows and stuff like that. So I got along very well and learned a few Ukrainian words like babushka and halapchi, pierogies, you know, you name it. But I was able to share our Cree language with the Ukrainian farmers that I worked for. But we had a very good relationship. All that to me is good memories, and especially a change from residential school. It gave me a break to take a risk to get out of the reservation. To my first contact with people outside my Indigenous was Ukrainians, and I love that. So I'll stop right there. I know we're pressed for time, but thank you, Barry, for noticing that I had my hand up. Hi.
Good eagle eye there, Barry. All right.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the comment about that project, Ancestors and Elders. For those who don't know, it was initiative from Shumka Ukrainian dancers to essentially tackle this conversation. It stemmed out of Myrna Kostash's experiment up on Alberta Avenue a few years prior, and was really meant to be, you know, let's just like jump into that conversation. And a lot of these issues started to come up from that, particularly with my co-director, Joseph Hoffman, trying to look at how do we get to what we want to see there. We want to see, you know, we saw the similarities in the Kolomeka and the round dances and this inclusivity of people just being able to come together and share and be present with one another. But it always grated against the reality of, you know, there's these injustices, there's this system that has deliberately dispossessed Indigenous people and redistributed that to mostly white or non-Indigenous people, either intentionally or unintentionally, or willfully or unwillfully. And so I was constantly looking at how do we tell this narrative in a way that doesn't just jump all of that and get to, you know, underneath it all, we're the same, same, but different. And we can move forward, you know, as though nothing has happened. And so part of this idea of land back, I believe, is a bit of reverse engineering how we got in this situation in the first place. I mean, Ukrainians and Indigenous folks can both experienced the intentional breakup of community from the Canadian government, the intentional attack on our women, and the intentional attack on our languages. All of those were to separate us from our ability to communicate with our children, our connection to the land and our connection to the power source that Canadian government is looking at acquiring, which is the territory and all of the resources that come with that, and the wealth that comes with that, and how to distribute that amongst Anglo white folks and not amongst the people that are coming in and breaking up the territory, or amongst the Indigenous people. So for me, partially, land back is, in the one sense, you know, rectifying that journey and attributing funds to residential school survivors, to the families of residential school survivors, to taking a look at treaties and how those have all gone down and where those have been broken apart, and just like very systematically addressing those issues, rather than fighting against Indigenous people in court, you know, helping and assisting and fixing that. But also about who's got the reins as far as how we're dealing with the ecology, and their relationship to the territory. Who are the people that are making decisions about how to do the cleanup in BC or Alberta, or how are we going to move forward with climate action? Is it going to be more, you know, nationalistic, capitalistic, white supremacist thinking, or is it going to be coming from someplace else where we have these knowledge holders that have other ways of approaching it? And I'd love for us to move in that direction. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. And it's not as though we have to work at odds. One of the things I'm always so amazed at is the lack of solidarity between non-Indigenous peoples living in rural areas with their Indigenous neighbors. Because if people were to link up to fight some of the things that are happening, so I'm thinking right now in Alberta, we've sort of shifted from coal mines to being like strip mines to gravel, like huge, absolutely massive extraction of gravel and aggregate, and it causes so many problems for everybody. It puts silt on people's crops. It damages the waterways. So these things impact everybody who lives there, and were people to come together instead of fighting separately would be so much more effective. And we do see this happening. We see that solidarity happening. It has happened. It will happen. But just being more intentional about it would be fantastic. And you worked better together with friends. I think about, all of the groups out there that there are land trusts that are held by non-Indigenous peoples, and they have the best of intentions. They care about the environment. They're doing work on cleaning up waterways and things like that. So, why are they not also making those connections with Indigenous nations who we all want to help? We all want to do these things, right? So I think that part of this is also recognizing we don't all have to replicate the same work. There's so much great work being done out there. And I think if people came together in bigger networks, we would become more effective at addressing the kinds of ecological pressures we're all under. Leon, so I want to get your ideas on land back, but also there was an interesting question about Métis Crossing. And it was asking if the boards of Métis Crossing and the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village have ever met to discuss joint programming, because you guys are so close. Is there any of that?
I don't think that there has ever been a formal meeting between the boards of Ukrainian Village and Métis Crossing. I can speak firsthand that there definitely has been meetings between the director of the Ukrainian Village and the managers and directors of Métis Crossing. I've had kind of conversations with different people there about specifically the chief historian at Ukrainian Village, about having some sort of a representation of the Indigenous story at the Ukrainian Village. I'm not sure that they're necessarily, they understand that relationship is there. I didn't get a sense that they were ready to move in that direction. I think that they need a little bit more coaxing, or they do a lot of stuff based on research. And I think there needs to be more things like this project here to create the foundational research to have that representation at Ukrainian Village. Because I know, I think everybody here knows that the relationship between the Indigenous people and the Ukrainian people is a very real relationship that happened since the first Ukrainians showed up to these lands, and continues to the present day. And I think we're all very aware that those relationships, I hope, will continue on into the future and are a very positive, beautiful thing. So I think that there definitely needs to be a place for that at one of our sites. I know that, at Métis Crossing, we acknowledge and celebrate our relationships with the Ukrainian people that exist around us. I mean, I'm one of them. I live here and work here every day, and you know, it's definitely part. So formalizing that relationship on the board level, that hasn't taken place yet, but the conversations between the management teams have definitely happened, but we haven't seen any, you know, formality moving forward on that. But yeah, I think that's definitely an area that you know should be explored and celebrated, and it's happening in a way right here. And I think that, you know, developing some sort of a on the ground cultural interpretation piece surrounding that relationship is, you know, projects like this could be the foundation of that cultural interpretation piece. So you know, and I think about it even in different things like the huska, which is, you know, wonderfully referred to amongst my my friends as the cookum scarf, you know. And I just think that that's such a beautiful representation of from one culture to the next, that exchange. You know, speaking about things like, you know, going back to your comment about language, you know, I was very fortunate enough to be attend a bilingual school growing up, so I learned Ukrainian from a very young age, and all the way through to university level. And you know, the cultural awareness that celebrating and learning your own language brings is very deep and profound. And I'm just really excited and happy to see the intentional revitalization of those Indigenous languages. The Cree language, I see a lot of the young people that I work with intentionally going and studying that. Same thing with the Michif revitalization. That's just going to strengthen those cultural ties. And, you know, there's one thing about bringing back these languages and speaking with them. You start to understand the way that these cultures interacted with the land, you know, which is starting to bring in the concept of land back there. The relationship to the land can be seen through the words that are used in these languages. You know, and I'm not proficient in much of Cree or Michif to be able to identify what those are. I know hearsay that they're in the Inuit languages. There's, you know, many different words for the word snow, and it just shows how important something like that is in that culture. So I think that the revitalization of the languages is going to help you know, make aware in the modern day the Indigenous relationships to the land. And, you know, when we talk about land acknowledgements, I think it's a wonderful thing. We're starting to see, you know, even the renaming of the wards in the city of Edmonton to have all Indigenous roots really bring acknowledgement to that. The one thing that I am cautious of is that the land acknowledgement is always deeply revered, and it just doesn't become a thing that we do at the beginning of the meeting and we move on. I think it's very important that we definitely hold that space at the beginning of those meetings when we do begin the land acknowledgements, that is done with great reverence, and we remember why we're doing that. And I think the way to maintain that, to avoid that just it's an empty ceremony, to avoid that is to dedicate ourselves to continually learning, celebrating, and exploring, you know, Indigenous languages, Indigenous relationships to the land, and finding ways to incorporate that, go beyond the acknowledgement, and find ways to incorporate that into our practices and our use of the land as well. So I think that, and things like that, tying back to your original comment, Chelsea, is to find ways to do that in our cultural sites, in our cultural celebrations, and it's not, I don't like to think of things as a static thing. You know, cultural exploration, cultural interpretation should never be static. It has to be a dedication to continually learning, continual celebration and exploration. So if we dedicate ourselves to those things, I think that we'll, you know, continue to find deeper meaning and celebration of Indigenous and Ukrainian relationships.
Absolutely, yeah. And Métis Crossing is a fantastic example. I know a lot of people are still wondering, what is land back? What is land back? Well, in this case, the Métis Nation had to actually buy back pieces of land that were once river lots. And now it is a place, like, it just blows me away, because I was there for the MNA General Assembly, and I hadn't been there in since it had just opened up, like year 2. And so now, you know, there are these spaces where Métis can gather together to do Métis things. You know, that's a wonderful thing, because we outside of the settlements, we tend to be landless. But also it's a place where people can come, and I feel like it is one of those safe spaces where people can come and learn about the Métis on the land, right? And that is so important, to be in those spaces on the land, not just learning about it, you know, looking at a video or looking at a book, but just being there and getting those kinds of things. So, you know, that is an example of what land back can mean. So yeah, and so Tara, we have a few minutes left before I'm going to open it up for questions, but I love bookending it here with, we've got some Ukrainian perspectives. So let's hear your ideas on land back.
Sure. And so I'm speaking from what I have learned from reading and engaging with Indigenous communities and scholars. And so from what I understand, and a couple of panelists have already touched on this, but firstly, really acknowledging Indigenous peoples as caretakers of this land. Often we recognize this in the past tense, but there is little to no recognition of this in the present tense and in a future tense. And then the necessary component being changing our practices and our land stewardship initiatives, decisions, etc., based on this fundamental principle. And so I think a couple of you have already mentioned kind of what would it mean for, you know, some of these ecological conservation groups that exist to really take lead from Indigenous peoples of the territories that they are trying to protect. And then as well, secondly, and Chelsea, you shared some really great examples of this, but returning public lands, you know, what we understand as public lands to Indigenous peoples. And again, not in that, yes, firstly, in that land stewardship caretaker sense, but also in the actual giving back of those public lands, you know, and we see right now, and I think how folks like myself can support land back initiatives such as this in a very practical way is, you know, when we have our colonial governments and other decision makers that are considering selling off these lands to other folks and for other purposes, is really pushing for that, you know, in the spirit of reconciliation, as more than just a symbolic gesture, like, let's give land back to Indigenous peoples here. And then thirdly, again, thinking through giving land back that we own. So there were some, I'll try to find it. There was an article of a settler family from Manitoba, I believe, that they were, you know, one option was going to be selling these lands for a profit for their family, but really, again, in the spirit of reconciliation and land back, they connected with the Indigenous peoples that were that had previously resided and lived on this land, and they literally gave that piece of land back. And yes, you know, it's a small homestead, but I think that really creates almost a precedent and creates the start of what land back can mean in certain contexts. And I think as well in an urban context, again, we can look to examples in Saskatchewan where there are examples of urban First Nations. So within the municipality, there are I think there's a couple places in Edmonton actually that are also designated First Nations within kind of, but not within the municipality, separate from the municipality. And I think these are all really contemporary and fantastic examples of what land back means, that, you know, and riffing off of Leah, you know, many of us who look like us, white settlers, and we do have anxiety about what supporting land back means for us. Are we displaced? And folks have talked about this point already, but just talking about and looking to these examples where we can see it happening successfully, and that it doesn't have to be this scary thing that's a tit for tat, that we act in support support of these things. And I think that is a really important piece for what we can do to support land back, is looking to how can we act in resistance to colonial land consumption, and then how can we act in support of land back initiatives and processes. So those are my thoughts.
Hi, awesome. All right, so we have a little bit of time for some questions. We've sort of addressed some of them as we went. It just kind of felt right. So if you do have some questions out there, please throw them into the Q&A or into the chat. There's one here that I thought I would just sort of throw out to anybody who wants to answer this. So it's basically, the question is, what are your thoughts about art as a way of acknowledging and building relationships? So I know there's a lot of folks here have some artistic bent. So what is the role, do you think, of art in sort of fostering the kinds of relationships we're talking about? What can it do? Don't make me pick one of yous.
I can speak to that a bit. Again, like, there's so many random little pathways to go down, but I mean, art, I think, for the one thing is that art is fun, right? It's an access point that people can come to, people enjoy it, people eat over art. You go for dinner before you go and see a show, and then you have a chat and something afterwards, and there's already a connectivity to art practice that I think that people just get. We consume so much art all the time, but the actual creation of it is where I think things really become exciting. When I was working again with the Shumka dancers, there were times where the powwow dancers and the Ukrainian dancers would come together, and you just see how they would share the athleticism of their work, try and get a move down, try and like figure something out from across the rehearsal or the studio, and immediately all these big conversations that feel so impossible were just like disappeared for a second while two people tried to figure out how the hell you got your leg to do that, right? And they're just trying to figure it out together. So I think that art has a huge benefit that way, just in a raw, human, interesting way. The other way is about narrative building. The way a lot of these conversations, I think about land back. One of the things that kind of twisted my brain around, I was working with kids on reserve down, and I was working mostly in Treaty 7. The way that they understood Calgary, Calgary was like so far away, and that wasn't our territory. But then when they started to understand, like, no, Treaty 7 is a Blackfoot treaty. Calgary is a part of this territory. Calgary is Blackfoot territory. That's your city, right? It's not the city of Calgary where the white folks live, and we have to live over here. That is our city. And as soon as you change the narrative, all of a sudden, the problem shifts, and it's not about giving land back that was like, it's about land that's there and continues to exist, and how do we mutually benefit from it? How do we share the way that the treaty was originally supposed to be done? How do we just go start from there, rather than trying to like pull out all the details and parse it out and figure out, okay, you owe me this and I owe you that, and let's do the math on it. It's like, no, let's just start with, let's change the story, let's change the name, let's change the narrative, and go from there. And I think art has a really beautiful way of allowing us to just plop into those different ways of looking at it and just run with it.
I love that. I'm just going to interrupt for a second, because you're harping on something that I love so much, and it's joy. We're always having these like deep, hard conversations about terrible things and trauma and stuff, but also like none of us live like that all the time. Like we have to make space in our lives for joy. And I feel like art is one of those ways that you can still address really intense, traumatic things, but you can also always bring that joy in. And that is what is going to sustain everything. Because if we just go around all day feeling bad, without that joy, what kind of life is that? So yeah, sorry, I was just joyful. All right. Okay, so this question is for Michelle. It's about language. So the question is basically, what do folks think about settlers learning an Indigenous language? So here Michelle says, I'm often conflicted about learning Cree and not wanting to consume a culture, but also respecting the land that I live on and that my people have settled on, you know, and also like, yeah, that tension. Should I do it? Should I not? Am I taking space away? So I know Leah wanted to answer this.
Yeah, absolutely. But before I do, Elder Francis, I saw that you had your hand up. Was there something that you wanted to say in response to the last question?
Geez, I'm just not on the ball today. Thank you.
Yeah, just basically this. In the last comments that I made, again, it has to do with land acknowledgement, but this medallion was made by one of our students. And this kind of art is all solid beadwork. And yet it acknowledges the Oilers, of course, but there's more than that. It's about the story of Turtle Island and the medicine wheel teachings. So art in regalia, when I think of those dancers and exchanging informations, the designs from the Ukrainian are very similar to native designs in many cases. But in even making those outfits or regalia, they're priceless because also they connect to the spirit of our people, the spirit of a lot of times you might see symbols of buffalo, eagles. It's to the spirit world, it's connection to creation, it's connection to land, and hummingbirds, butterflies, and even the hoop dancer has stories on all those hoops, but it's also about physique, recreation, and stamina. And those kind of things require a lot of connection to values, meditation, patience, humility, and just basically moving the spirit of the people. That's what song and dance does. It moves the spirit of the people, even in their downtimes, the negative histories. But all those dances and art comes in many forms. They tell stories. They tell stories of the past. They tell stories about connection and relationship. I just wanted to mention that. So again, thank you. And you know what? I have to leave very soon. I'm going overtime. I was supposed to have another meeting at 6 apparently.
Thank you for staying as long as you did then, Elder Francis. Thank you. Hi. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about dance and joy, I am one of the few old adult dancers at my Ukrainian dance school, and it's absolutely wonderful. The joy of dancing, the joy of moving your body in ways that connect you to your ancestors, to your past, but also then seeing the young children who are also learning to dance as well. I absolutely love it. And Elder Whiskey Jack, I would love if one day I was invited to bring my red boots and my my flowing ribbon headpiece to a powwow. That would be absolutely stellar. So one of the questions that I wanted to address is about white folks or Muniao learning Cree. And so in Cree, I am a Muniao. I am a foreigner. I am the other person. One of the things that I found about learning Cree, so fortunately was able to take 1 year of Cree. I would love to take more, but in university, it was part of my requirement. And I'm not going to lie, at the beginning, I was very trepidatious about this little white girl coming in and being like, I can learn Cree. Like, you know, I was like, there's so many things that should be scared about here. And I didn't want to feel like I was appropriating anyone's culture or consuming culture or commodifying it in any way. But one of the things that I quickly realized was that it was so far that my fears were so quickly put to the side that learning Cree was amazing. Learning another language gives you so much knowledge about how people order their world, how they think about the world, how they how they think about their relationships, how they think about how they envision Wokotowin, how they envision their relationships with everything around them. I remember like learning about how things were, instead of like male, female, which we think about in English, things were animate and inanimate. And that took me so long to try to figure out, like, how does that work? And but once I started to understand, you can then start to understand a little bit more about a different worldview from your own. And that to me was the absolute magic in learning Cree, was that it gave me, learning a little bit of Cree was learning so much about different worldview, about how people construct the world around them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah. And so I have my dream job. I get to teach Cree at the university. And yeah, I am a strong advocate that you should learn an Indigenous language of the territory you live in. There should be enough resources available. You know, when I think about the future, we all have the ability to, both as Indigenous peoples, reclaim our languages, and a lot of our ancestors were multilingual. I would love to be multilingual in Indigenous languages as well, not just European ones. And I think that, you know, everybody should have that opportunity to learn. It opens up so much. So I wanted to just give Tara and Leon a chance to sort of like wrap things up a little bit with any final thoughts that you had. If you just want to respond to things that you've heard, or add, you know, you've got this pressing thought that's you've been waiting to share, please feel free. So I'll start with Tara.
Sure. Thanks, Chelsea. I apologize if these kind of last thoughts are a bit sporadic, but something that has stood with me from our initial conversation as panelists when we met each other a few weeks ago was, Chelsea, actually a question that you brought forward to help us think about this panel in our conversation. And it was really rejecting the idea of apocalypse. And I think that that's something that I think is really important to hold true to, and as well in tying that thread to thinking about joy and thinking about coming into our future, our shared future, that we don't have to think about or we don't have to accept an apocalyptic future, that we can create a joyful relational future. And I think that is something that I think just really stuck with me from previous conversations, have felt really heavy, and like you said, you know, we're talking about, in many contexts, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about violence and genocide, and in some ways we must acknowledge that unless we do things differently, we may end up in an apocalyptic state. However, it does not. We can reject that idea in moving forward together, and in moving forward in a good way, with joy, in partnership, in relation to each other and land and space here. And I also wanted to just kind of lastly kind of acknowledge this. I'm not, my work is not related to art. However, just wanted to acknowledge again that the power of the art being a fantastic avenue for entering in these conversations and showcasing not only what our present looks like, but again, in imagining a different future. And I think, I'm just really hopeful. I think we come to these conversations now with a lot of hope in thinking and imagining things differently. And I guess I think it will take work, but in that work we can also find the joy and art, and we can find our our path to telling these stories differently and to imagining a different future. So again, thank you for the wonderful conversation today and learning from the rest of the panel and the folks who have brought insightful questions.
Okay, thank you. And Leon, we're going to end with you, I guess. And you're also just sitting in front of this beautiful piece of artwork, by the way.
This is a mural that was painted by Stephen Gladue from Fishing Lake Métis Settlement, and there's also accents in here. The beadwork was done by Lisa Shepherd, and it was imposed there. So you can come to Métis Crossing and see it in person. Thank you for acknowledging that, Chelsea. When I just some closing thoughts on this whole narrative about Ukrainian Indigenous relationships. Northeast Alberta is home to the largest block settlement of Ukrainian people outside of Ukraine. And my understanding is that when the Canadian government was inviting Ukrainians to come and live on these lands, they tried very, very hard to ensure that the Indigenous people that lived here were already placed on reservations, so that when the Ukrainian people showed up here, they would not have any interaction with them. And I think that when we see that over time, and we can see it in the people and the relationships that have established, that did not work, luckily, because I think that the relationship between these people was necessary, and it proves the power of community and the power of being neighbors. And I think that this discussion about the relationship there is something that we've always known it existed from our own experiences, our own relationships with each other. And I think initiatives like this are very, very important to document that, celebrate that, and find these stories. And so that we can incorporate them in places like Métis Crossing, in places like Saddle Lake, in places like Ukrainian Village, because that's a part of all of how we all got here, and about where we are today and where we're going. So I think it's wonderful, and thank you for being a part of this, for letting me be a part of this today. And thank you, Elder, for your words and prayers this morning to open this all off. And I look forward to more conversations like this and art stemming from ideas like this, like the Ancestors and Elders piece. I think it's a wonderful thing that is truly unique to this part of the world. And thank you.
Thank you, all of you, nîkânihk and wow, very, very much to everyone. I'm sorry if I cut you off or you didn't get to say the things that you want to say. I feel like, as always with these conversations, that we could literally spend hours on this. So I hope to actually meet you all in person. At when I've met Leah and Elder, but one day when we could actually visit again, that would be fantastic. And thank you to, I know that there are some people who have been following these sessions throughout, and if you have missed any of them, recordings are up, so you can go look at what was discussed before. This is kind of our last thing for the year, and I am so happy that it ended on this hopeful note. I feel like we're going somewhere. And Elder, I'm not going to miss your hand this time. Yes, please.
Just one thing I need to say: if you haven't visited Fort Edmonton Indigenous Experience, please do. You'll learn lots.
Absolutely, and it's still open during the winter, I believe. So folks can go.
On the
awesome.
Weekend, yeah.
All right, so we're at time. Thank you, everybody, and go have a wonderful evening full of joy.